Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh did not fall so much as it hovered, a thick grey haar that clung to the hills like a damp woolen blanket. It was the sort of weather that made the residents of the Sutherland village retreat into their cottages, stoke their peat fires, and wait for the spring, which everyone knew was a polite fiction invented by the tourist board. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth sat in the kitchen of the police station, his long, gangly frame draped over a wooden chair that had seen better decades. His shock of ginger hair was uncombed, and his hazel eyes were fixed with intense concentration on a small pot of coffee bubbling on the stove. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of uncertain lineage and vast ears, let out a long, shuddering sigh that mirrored his master's mood. The phone on the wall jangled. Hamish didn't move. He knew the sound of that ring. It was the sharp, impatient trill of headquarters in Strathbane. If he answered it, he might be told to go and investigate a broken fence in Drim, or worse, be summoned to the station to fill out the diversity and inclusion forms that DCI Blair found so personally offensive. "If we dinna hear it, Lugs," Hamish murmured in his soft Highland lilt, "then it didna happen. Philosophy is a grand thing for a lazy man. The peace of Lochdubh had been recently disturbed, not by crime, but by the arrival of Mr. Julian Vane Smythe." Julian was a Sassenach of the most exhausting variety, a man who wore brand-new barber jackets that had never seen a speck of mud and who spoke to the locals as if they were slightly dim-witted children in a Victorian primer. He had purchased The Gables, a Victorian monstrosity on the edge of the loch, and had immediately set about modernizing the village by complaining about the smell of the fish trucks and the sound of the church bell. A sharp rap at the door broke Hamish's reverie. He sighed, stood up, and shuffled to the door, adjusting his uniform so it looked slightly less like he'd slept in it, which he had. Standing on the step was Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, her face a mask of pinched indignation. "Hamish Macbeth, I know you're in there. I saw the smoke from the chimney." "Morning, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's a grand day for the ducks. It is a disgraceful day for Lochdubh," she snapped. "That man Vane Smythe is at it again. He's parked his Jaguar right across the entrance to the Kirk path, and he's currently screaming at Archie McLean because Archie's sheep, quite rightly, don't recognise the concept of private property." "Sheep are notorious anarchists," Hamish agreed solemnly. "Go and do something, Hamish. He's threatening to sue the entire village for emotional distress, because the New Year's bell ringing gave him a migraine." Hamish sighed. He reached for his peaked cap, which was sitting on a pile of unopened mail. "I suppose I'd better go and see the gentleman. Though, in my experience, folk who get emotional distress in the Highlands usually find it's just the damp getting into their bones." As he walked down the main street, the wind whistling off the loch, Hamish saw the Jaguar. It was a gleaming, silver beast that looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of rusted Land Rovers and salt-stained cottages. Julian Vane Smythe was standing in the road, his face the colour of a ripe plum, waving a manicured finger at Archie McLean. "It's primitive," Julian was shouting. "I pay more in council tax than this entire hotel combined. I want those animals moved, and I want that ridiculous bell silenced. It's a noise nuisance." Hamish approached with a slow, rolling gait, his expression one of vacant, helpful stupidity. "Is there a problem, sir?" Hamish asked, his voice dropping an octave into a thick, rustic burr. "Has a sheep offended you? They can be very rude when they've had a bit of fermented clover." Julian turned on him, his eyes bulging. "You, policeman, arrest this man. His livestock has defecated on my driveway, and I have a conference call with London at noon." Hamish looked at the sheep, then at the driveway, then at Julian. He scratched his head. "Well now, sir, under the Ancient Rights of Way Act of 1704, or was it 1705, Archie's sheep have what we call the grazing precedence. It's a very complicated legal matter. I'd have to go back to the station." And read several very large, very dusty books. "It could take weeks," Julian sputtered, unable to find words. Hamish smiled internally. It was the Hamish Macbeth defence. Be so unhelpful and appear so dense that the outsider eventually gave up and went away. But as Hamish watched Julian Vane Smythe storm back into his mansion, slamming the heavy oak door, he felt a familiar prickle at the back of his neck. The Highlands didn't like being shouted at, and Lochdubh had a very long memory for those who tried to silence its bells. The following morning, the ha had lifted, replaced by a sky the colour of a bruised plum, and a wind that sliced through the village like a Highland dirk. Hamish had spent a restless night in his narrow bed, dreaming of giant sheep with the faces of London bankers. He was up early, not out of a sense of duty, but because his stomach was rumbling with a hollow insistence that only a properly poached salmon could satisfy. He had spent a quiet hour by the banks of the Andoo, his movements as fluid and silent as the water itself, and was now heading back toward the police station with a fine, silver-scaled fish hidden expertly beneath his heavy greatcoat. Lugs trotted at his heels, his ears twitching at every rustle in the heather, sharing his master's sense of illicit triumph. However, the peace of the morning was shattered as they approached the village square. It wasn't the sound of the kirk bell, which Julian Van Smythe had so loudly protested, but a sound far more alarming to Hamish's ears, the high-pitched, frantic screaming of a woman. It was coming from the direction of the gables. Hamish sighed, the weight of the salmon suddenly feeling like a leaden omen of a ruined day. He hurried his pace, his long legs eating up the distance until he reached the iron gates of the Vain Smythe estate. There stood Mrs. Gillespie, the daily woman who did for the newcomers, her hands pressed to her cheeks and her apron fluttering in the gale. She was pointing toward the ornamental fountain in the centre of the manicured front lawn, a marble monstrosity featuring a pair of leaping dolphins that looked entirely miserable in the Scottish climate. "Oh, Hamish, it's terrible, just terrible," she wailed as he approached. "I went to let myself in the side door, and I looked over, and there he was. I thought he was just playing a trick. But he's not moving, Hamish. He's not moving at all." Hamish followed her gaze. The sight that met him was both grim and, in a dark Highland way, faintly ridiculous. Julian Vane Smythe was indeed in the fountain. He was draped over the marble dolphins in a pose that suggested a very drunken embrace. His head was submerged in the shallow icy basin, while his legs, clad in expensive silk pyjamas and cashmere slippers, dangled over the edge. What made the scene truly bizarre was the fact that a large decorative New Year's wreath, the very one that had been hung on the village hall, was looped firmly around High's neck, pinning him to the stone structure like a festive garland. "Stay back, Mrs. Gillespie," Hamish said, his voice losing its lazy burr and snapping into a tone of quiet authority. He moved toward the fountain, his boots crunching on the gravel. He reached down, his large hands gentle, and lifted Julian's head from the water. One look at the blue-tinged skin and the fixed, staring eyes told him everything he needed to know. Julian Vane Smythe would never complain about a kirk bell again. Hamish stood back, his keen eyes scanning the area. There were no signs of a struggle in the gravel, though the heavy rain from the night before would have washed away any subtle footprints. He noted the way the wreath was positioned. It hadn't just fallen there. It had been pulled tight, the wire frame biting into the silk of the pyjamas. It was a humiliating way to go. The great London financier drowned in 6 inches of water by a Christmas decoration. "Lugs, stay," Hamish commanded as the dog began to sniff at a discarded object near the base of the fountain. It was a silver hip flask, its cap unscrewed. Hamish didn't touch it. He knew the rules of the game, even if he found them tedious. He looked at the house's darkened windows. The curtains were drawn, the great stone building appearing silent and indifferent to the tragedy on its lawn. "Right then," Hamish muttered to himself, a feeling of deep gloom settling over him. "That's the end of my breakfast." He knew what came next, a deer in Lochdubh, especially one involving a wealthy Sassenach, would bring the heavy-handed machinery of the Strathbane police down upon them like an avalanche. He would have to call it in. He would have to deal with the paperwork, the shouting, and the inevitable arrival of the man he detested most in the world. He escorted the sobbing Mrs. Gillespie back to her cottage, offering her the kind of vague, platitudinous comfort that he knew she expected. Once she was settled with a cup of tea, Hamish trudged back to the police station. He placed his poached salmon in the sink, looking at it with genuine regret. He then took the phone and dialed the Strathbane headquarters number. "Lochdubh Police Station. Constable Macbeth speaking," he said when the line connected. "I'm reporting a sudden death at the Gables. Aye, the Van Smythe place. Sounds like a murder, Sergeant. And you better tell DCI to bring his wellies. It's a bit damp out here." He hung up and sat at his kitchen table, staring at the bubbling coffee pot. Within 2 hours, the quiet air of the village was torn by the wail of sirens. 2 white and blue police cars and a black, unmarked sedan roared down the narrow main streets, scattering Archie McLean's sheep and sending the locals scurrying to their windows. DCI Blair exploded from the black car before it had even come to a complete halt. He was a short, thick-set man with a face like a slab of raw beef and a temperament to match. He wore a cheap suit that struggled to contain his girth and an expression of permanent simmering rage. Behind him trailed Jimmy Anderson, his weary-looking sergeant, who was already fumbling for a notebook. "Macbeth," Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the station. "Where is he? Where's the body? If you've dragged me out here for a common heart attack, I'll have your badge for a coaster." Hamish stepped out onto the porch, his hands deep in his pockets, looking every bit the useless peasant Blair believed him to be. "Morning, sir. He's in the big house. In the fountain. It's a very festive sort of death, if you like that kind of thing." Blair shoved past him, nearly knocking lugs over. "Move it, you ginger streak of nothing. Anderson, get the tape up. I want this scene secured before the locals start stealing the victim's shoes. And Macbeth, stay out of the way. Don't touch anything, Don. Breathe on anything. And for God's sake, don't try to think. It only leads to disaster." Hamish watched them go, a small, grim smile playing on his lips. He knew Blair would look at the hip flask, look at the fountain, and decide within 10 minutes that Julian Vane Smythe had simply had too much malt and tripped. But Hamish had seen something Blair hadn't. He had seen the way the wreath had been twisted, a specific professional knot used by those who spent their lives working with rope and wire. It wasn't the work of a drunkard, it was the work of someone who knew exactly how to make a murder look like. An embarrassing accident. As the detectives began their loud, clumsy investigation, Hamish decided it was time to go for a walk. He needed to find out who in Lochdubh had been angry enough to turn a New Year's greeting into a noose. Blair's shouting could be heard all the way down to the pier, a harsh, rhythmic barking that competed with the crying of the gulls. The DCI stood by the fountain, his face turning a shade of purple that almost matched the deceased man's silk pajamas. He was currently berating Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, who was trying to photograph the body while avoiding the spray of water still trickling from the stone dolphins' mouths. Hamish stood a respectful distance away, leaning against a mossy stone wall with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked for all the world like a man contemplating nothing more serious than the price of wool, but his eyes were darting, cataloguing the frantic, disorganized energy of the Strathbane team. "It's an open and shut case, you moron!" Blair yelled, pointing a stubby finger at the silver hip flask Hamish had spotted earlier. The man was a notorious soak. Everyone knows these London types can't handle the local malts. He came out here in the middle of the night to have a private nip, got dizzy in the hair, and tumbled headfirst into the basin. The wreath? It's obvious. He must have grabbed at the door frame or the gate on his way out, got it tangled round his neck and dragged it with him. It's an accidenta. Drowning. I want the body cleared out of here by noon. I've got a golf game in Strathbane, and I'm not missing it for a drunk Sassenach who couldn't stay on his feet. But, sir, Anderson ventured, wiping a droplet of fountain water from his lens, the way the wreath is tied. It's very tight, and the house was locked from the inside. If he came for a drink, why wouldn't he have his keys? We found them on the hall table. He was drunk, Anderson. Drunk people don't take keys. They don't do anything logical. That's why they're drunk. Blair turned his venomous gaze toward Hamish. And what are you gawking at, Macbeth? Haven't you got a sheep to dip or a tourist to swindle? Your presence here is officially redundant. Go back to your station and stay by the phone in case I need someone to fetch us some sandwiches. And make them decent ones, not that grey mutton you people seem to favour. Hamish touched the brim of his cap in a gesture that looked like respect but felt like a dismissal. Whatever you say, sir. It's a curious thing about that wreath. It's the one from the village hall, you see, the one Archie McLean's sister made. She uses a very particular gauge of florist's wire, heavy stuff. It would take a fair bit of strength to pull it that tight around a man's throat. even a man who's had a dram or two. Blair took 2 steps toward Hamish, his chest puffed out like a territorial pigeon. Are you trying to tell me how to do my job, Macbeth? Are you suggesting— This was foul play, in Lochdubh, Northern Hemisphere's most boring village. Listen to me, you long-legged streak of misery. This was an accident. Vane Smythe was an arrogant fool who didn't know his limits. If I hear one single word, about a murder investigation, I will have you transferred to a traffic beat in the centre of Glasgow so fast your red hair will turn white. Do I make myself clear? Crystal, sir, Hamish said softly, his Highland lilt thickening. An accident it is. A tragic festive accident. I'll just be wandering along now. I wouldn't want to be getting in the way of real police work. He turned and whistled for Lugs, who had been sitting patiently by the gate. As they walked away from the gables, Hamish could feel Blair's eyes burning into his back. The DCI wanted an easy out, a way to wrap up the paperwork and head back to the comforts of the city. He didn't care about the truth, he cared about his handicap and his standing with the chief constable, but Hamish knew that Julian Vane Smythe, for all his faults, was a man of meticulous habits. A man who wore silk pyjamas and cashmere slippers would not wander out into a freezing Highland night without his keys, and he certainly wouldn't be able to accidentally garrote himself with a Christmas wreath while falling into a fountain. As he reached the village square, Hamish saw the curtains twitching in 6 cottages. The news had travelled faster than the wind. Lochdubh was a place where silence was a language of its own, and right now the silence was deafening. He did not return to the station. Instead, he made his way to Patel's grocery store, which served as the village's unofficial nerve centre. If Julian Vane Smythe had been making enemies, and Hamish was certain he had, the evidence wouldn't be found in a forensic lab. It would be found in the crumbs of local gossip and the shared grievances of the breakfast table. Entering the shop, the bell gave a cheerful tinkle that felt entirely inappropriate given the morning's grim discovery. Mr. Patel was behind the counter, meticulously arranging tins of evaporated milk, but his eyes were bright with anticipation. "A terrible business, Constable," Patel said, leaning forward. "A very wet business. They say the poor man looked like a drowned rat in a garland." "News travels fast, Mr. Patel," Hamish remarked, picking up a packet of biscuits and examining the ingredients, as if they were the most interesting thing in the world. "I didn't know the DCI had released the details." "He didn't have to," Patel whispered, casting a glance toward the door. "Old Mrs. Christie was out walking her terrier at 6 this morning. She saw the police cars. She also saw someone else, Hamish. Someone leaving the grounds of the Gables long before you or the Strathbane lot arrived. Someone who wasn't wearing pyjamas." Hamish felt the familiar hum of the chase begin to stir in his chest. He set the cookies and looked Patel in the eye. "And did Mrs. Christie happen to mention if this person was carrying anything? Like, perhaps, a pair of wire cutters?" Patel shook his head slowly. "She didn't say, but she did say the person was walking with a limp, a very pronounced limp, like they'd been kicked by a mule or a sheep." Hamish thought of Archie MacLean and his anarchist livestock. He thought of the Sassenach tension that had been boiling over for weeks. Blair might be looking for a drunkard's stumble, but Hamish was starting to see the shape of a much more deliberate dance. He needed to talk to the villagers, but first he needed to find out exactly what had happened during the New Year's Eve celebration at the village hall. Somewhere between the Auld Lang Syne and the first light of dawn, a neighbourly feud had turned into a death sentence. "I'll take these biscuits, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, reaching for his coins, "and maybe a bit of that sharp cheddar. It's going to be a long afternoon of listening to people tell me what they didn't see." He walked out into the cold air, his mind already turning over the names of every man in the village who carried a grudge and walked with a hitch in his stride. The investigation had begun, and as usual, the official police were the last ones who would know anything about it. Hamish pocketed the cheddar and tucked the biscuits into his greatcoat, the weight of the salmon still a secret burden against his hip. The village square was deceptively quiet, but he could feel Lochdubh's eyes behind every lace curtain and salt-crusted pane of glass. DCI Blair's sirens had long since faded into a distant memory, replaced by the rhythmic slap of the loch against the pier and the mournful cry of a lone buzzard circling the heights of Ben Buida. To an outsider it was a scene of pastoral peace. To Hamish It was a pressure cooker of unspoken resentment. He knew that to solve a Highland murder, one did not look at fingerprints. One looked at the history of a man's debts, his slights, and the way he poured his tea. He made his way toward the Tommel Castle Hotel, the grandest building in the area, owned by the father of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. If there was a source of information more concentrated than Mr. Patel's shop, it was the hotel's kitchen, where the staff gathered to dissect the failings of the gentry. As he pushed open the heavy service door, the warmth of the range and the smell of roasting venison greeted him like an old friend. Nessie, the cook, was a woman of formidable girth and an even more formidable memory. She was currently battering a piece of dough as if it had personally insulted her ancestors. "I suppose you are here for a handout, Macbeth," Nessie barked, though her eyes softened as she reached for a clean mug. "Or have you come to tell us how the great London financier managed to drown in a bird bath? It was a fountain, Nessie, and it's a sad day for the village when a guest meets his end in such a fashion," Hamish said, sliding onto a stool and looking as pathetic as he could manage. "The DCI from Strathbane is convinced it was the drink. A tragic accident, he calls it. He's a very busy man, has no time for the subtleties of Lochdubh life." Nessie snorted, a sound like a Highland pony clearing its lungs. "Accident? That man had the balance of a mountain goat when it came to guarding his money. He was here 2 nights ago, screaming at the manager because there was a draft in the library. He didn't look like a man who'd fall into a fountain by mistake. He looked like a man who'd sue the water for being too wet." She poured a stream of thick, black coffee into Hamish's mug and pushed a plate of warm scones toward him. "And what about that wreath? Mrs. Christie says it was the one from the hall, the one Julian Vane Smythe tried to have banned because the pine needles triggered his allergies." Hamish took a slow, thoughtful bite of a scone. "Is that so? He wanted the New Year's wreath banned. He was a man of many complaints, it seems. He was a man who didn't know how to keep his mouth shut." Nessie lowered her voice, leaning over the flowered table. "He'd been sniffing around the accounts of the Highland Restoration Fund. You know the one, the charity the Colonel and the local bigwigs run. He told Archie McLean right in the middle of the pub that the books looked creative. Archie didn't take kindly to it. He told Vane Smythe that if he didn't stop poking his nose where it wasn't wanted, someone might just clip it for him. Archie has a temper, but he's mostly hot air and sheep dip," Hamish mused. "But what about this limp Patel mentioned? Mrs. Christie saw someone leaving the Gables this morning with a hitch in their stride." Nessie paused, her rolling pin hovering in mid-air. "A limp, you say? Well, half the men in this village walk like they've been stepped on by a heifer, but there's only one man who's been complaining about his leg lately, and that's Peter the Post. Says he twisted his ankle on the ice outside Vane Smythe's gate 3 days ago. He was threatening to put in a claim for industrial injury." Hamish nodded, memorizing the details. Peter the Post was a man who saw every letter that entered Lochdubh. He knew who was in debt, who was receiving solicitors' letters, and who was conducting clandestine affairs through the Royal Mail. If Vane Smythe had been digging into local secrets, Peter would have been the first to notice the paper trail. Hamish finished his coffee, feeling the caffeine sharpen the edges of his mind. He needed to find Peter, but he also needed to avoid Blair, who was likely still stomping around the crime scene looking for someone to blame for his ruined golf game. As he left the hotel, the rain began to fall again, a fine, persistent drizzle that blurred the lines between the mountains and the sky. He walked toward the post office, his boots clicking on the damp stones. He found Peter the Post leaning against his red van, smoking a cigarette, ND looking thoroughly miserable. His left ankle was heavily bandaged, and he was indeed favouring his right side. "Rough weather for a delivery, Peter," Hamish shouted. Peter looked up, his eyes narrowing. "It's rough weather for living, Hamish, especially with police crawling everywhere like lice on a dog. I suppose you're here to ask me about the Englishman?" "Just passing by, Peter, just passing by. I heard you had a bit of a tumble near his house. Dangerous place, the Gables, between the ice and the fountains. It's a wonder anyone survives a visit." Peter spat on the ground. "He was a nasty piece, Macbeth. He stopped me on the road last week and accused me of opening his mail. Said he'd have me sacked. Me! I've been delivering the post in this glen since before he was out of short trousers. He had a letter from a bank in London. A private matter, he said. He didn't like the fact that I knew it was marked urgent and confidential. And was it? Hamish asked softly. Everything was urgent with him. But that one, he turned white as a sheet when he saw the return address. He wasn't just a rich man playing at being a squire, Hamish. He was a man running from something, and I think whatever it was, it finally caught up with him in that fountain. Hamish leaned against the van, the cold metal seeping through his coat. The picture was shifting. Vane Smythe wasn't just a nuisance. He was a man under pressure, a man who had been making enemies of the very people who provided his service and his sanctuary. He had insulted the traditions of the village, threatened the livelihoods of the locals, and poked at the skeletons in the colonel's closet. "Did you see anyone else near the gates this morning, Peter, when you were out on your rounds?" Peter hesitated, his gaze shifting toward the loch. "I saw a car, a dark one, parked down by the old jetty. Not a local car. It was gone by the time the sun was up, but it had those fancy city plates. If you ask me, Hamish, the wreath was a local touch, but the trouble came from further south." Hamish thanked him and moved on, his mind whirling. A local touch with city trouble. It was a classic Highland complication. He needed a sounding board, someone who understood the nuances of the upper-class world Vane Smythe had fled from. He turned his steps toward the Halberton Smythe estate. It was time to talk to Priscilla. She might not know about sheep or wire, but she knew about the kind of desperation that made a man turn white at the sight of a bank's logo. The driveway to the Halberton Smythe estate was lined with ancient rhododendrons that shivered in the biting wind, their leaves curled tight against the cold. Hamish trudged up the gravel path, Lugs following with a dejected air as if he too felt the weight of the morning's grim discovery. The big house loomed out of the mist, a monument to a fading aristocracy that still commanded respect in the glen. Hamish didn't go to the front door. He knew the colonel would likely be in a foul mood, blustering about the police presence in the village. Instead, he made his way toward the stables, where he knew he would find Priscilla. He found her leaning against a stall door, watching a stable hand groom a large bay hunter. Priscilla Halberton Smythe was, as always, a vision of effortless elegance that made Hamish feel more than usually clumsy and unkempt. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a practical knot, and her tailored riding breeches and polished boots suggested a world of order and privilege that was currently being disrupted by the chaos at the Gables. She looked up as Hamish approached, a faint, weary smile touching her lips. "I heard the news, Hamish," she said, her voice cool and steady. "The village is practically vibrating with it. My father is in the library, currently deciding whether to be outraged by the murder or by the fact that DCI Blair parked his car on the verge. Poor Julian. He was a dreadful man, but one doesn't wish a Christmas wreath as a final accessory on anyone." Hamish leaned against a wooden post, looking at his boots. "The DCI is convinced it was a drunken tumble. He's already written the closing statement in his head so he can get back to his golf. But I've been talking to Peter the Post and Nessie at the hotel. There's a bit of a smell about the whole thing, Priscilla, and it's not just the loch at low tide." Priscilla stepped away from the stall and walked with Hamish toward the edge of the paddock. Why from prying ears? Julian Vane Smythe was a man built on sand, Hamish. He came here with a lot of noise and money, but those of us in certain circles knew the money was, let's say, precarious. He was involved in a series of offshore investments that went spectacularly wrong last quarter. He didn't come to Lochdubh for the scenery. He came here to hide from people who don't take kindly to losing their capital. Hiding in a village where everyone knows what colour of socks you're wearing seems a poor choice, Hamish remarked, his hazel eyes fixed on the distant peaks. But Peter mentioned a letter, confidential from a London bank, and a dark car seen by the pier in the early hours. "Does the name Vane Smythe mean anything to you beyond the arrogance and the Barber jackets?" Priscilla sighed, a small puff of white in the frozen air. "It means debt, Hamish, deep, ruinous debt. But there's something else. Julian wasn't just losing his own money. He was managing funds for others, local others. He'd been very charming to some of the wealthier families in the county, promising returns that were, quite frankly, impossible. My father was too old-fashioned to fall for it, but I know for a fact that he'd been having regular, rather heated meetings with the local land agent, Mr. Forbes." "Forbes?" Hamish straightened up slightly. "The man who manages the Sutherland estates?" He's a quiet sort of fellow, always looks like he's just swallowed a sour plum. Quiet, yes, but he has a dow. Eater with expensive tastes and a gambling habit he's been trying to fund for years, Priscilla replied, her eyes meeting Hamish's with a significance he didn't miss. Forbes was seen at the Gables late yesterday afternoon. They were on the terrace, and Forbes didn't look like a man enjoying a social call. He looked like a man who was being told his life savings had vanished into a black hole in the Cayman Islands. Hamish felt a piece of the puzzle click into place. He thought of the wreath again, the specific tight wiring that required strong, practiced hands. A land agent would be very familiar with wire, fences, and the sturdy knots needed to keep the Highlands in order. But he also thought of the limp Mrs. Christie had described. Forbes didn't limp. He walked with the stiff military precision of a man who measured his life in acres and chains. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said softly. "You have a way of seeing the things that Blair ignores because they don't fit into a tidy box." "Be careful, Hamish," she warned, reaching out to touch his arm briefly. "If Julian was truly being hunted by city creditors and local desperate men, you're standing in the middle of a very dangerous crossfire. Blair will look for a scapegoat, and he'd love nothing more than to pin a botched investigation on you." Hamish nodded, his mind already racing. He left the estate and began the walk back toward the village, but he didn't head for the station. He took a detour through the backwoods, a path that led toward the old stone bridge, where the land agent's cottage sat tucked away in a glen. The wind was picking up, howling through the pines, and the sky had turned a leaden, ominous grey. As he walked, he thought about what Priscilla had said. The local touch Peter the Post had mentioned was looking more and more like a deliberate act of desperation, but the dark car at the jetty still bothered him. If a killer had come from the city, why use a village hall wreath? It was too poetic, too specific to Lochdubh. It was an act of local vengeance disguised as a freak accident. He reached the edge of Forbes's property and paused. There, parked in the shadows of the carriage house, was a dark sedan. It wasn't the victim's silver Jaguar, nor was it the battered Land Rover Forbes usually drove. It was a black Mercedes, its plates caked in the salt and grime of a long journey from the south. And as Hamish watched, a figure stepped out of the cottage. Not Forbes, but a man in a sharp, dark overcoat who walked with a very pronounced, heavy limp. The man looked around surreptitiously, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters, tossing them carelessly into the back seat of the car before driving off toward the main road. Hamish crouched low in the gorse, his heart hammering against his ribs. The red herring was beginning to smell, and the truth was far more tangled than a New Year's wreath. He had his outsider, he had his limp, and he had high-S weapon. Now all he had to do was figure out how the land agent, the London hitman, and a village decoration all came together in a frozen fountain. He turned to Luggs, who was shivering beside him. "Come on, lad. We need to see Archie McLean. I think it's time we talked about who exactly helped themselves to the wreath from the village hall." The cold had settled into Hamish's bones, but the sight of those wire cutters in the back of the black Mercedes had acted like a jolt of strong Highland tea. He stayed low in the gorse until the tail lights of the sedan vanished into the thickening mist toward the Strathbane road. Luggs gave a low, questioning whine, his tail drooping in the damp air, but Hamish only laid a calming hand on the dog's head. The pieces of the puzzle were swirling like the snow that was beginning to flake out of the leaden sky, but they weren't settling into the shape DCI Blair wanted. Hamish knew he had to move fast, or the wrong man would be spending the night in a cold cell in Strathbane, and the true killer would be halfway to the border. He made his way back toward the centre of Lochdubh, avoiding the main road where the police cruisers were still prowling. As he approached the village hall, he saw the blue lights of an ambulance and Blair's car parked crookedly outside Archie McLean's cottage. A small crowd of villagers had gathered at a respectful, gossiping distance, their faces pale discs in the gloom. Blair was on the porch, his voice a rhythmic roar that carried over the sound of the wind. He was gesturing wildly toward Archie, who was being led out by two burly officers from the Strathbane squad. Archie looked smaller than usual, his weathered face twisted in a mixture of fear and stubborn Highland pride. "I told you, Macbeth!" Blair shouted as he spotted Hamish approaching from the shadows. "I told you it was an open and shut case. We found the motive and we found the man. Archie here had a standing feud with Vane Smythe over the sheep, and we've just found a set of the victim's cufflinks in Archie's kitchen drawer. Theft turned to murder. The old fool got greedy, the Englishman caught him, and Maclean used that wreath to finish him off. It's a classic local hit. Rough, amateur and stupid. Archie looked at Hamish, his eyes pleading. I did, Hamish. I never touched the man. Those links, I never saw them before in my life. Someone put them there, I tell you. Shut up, Maclean, Blair barked, shoving Archie toward the waiting car. Save it for the lawyers. Anderson, get him in the back. And Macbeth, you can stop looking like a confused cow. The case is solved. I'll be expecting a full report on your desk. Not that I'll read it. By tomorrow morning. We're taking him in. Hamish stood silently as the cruiser sped away, its tires spitting gravel. He didn't argue. To argue with Blair when he was in the grip of a brilliant realization was like shouting at the Atlantic tide. It only left you wet and tired. But Hamish's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the cufflinks. Archie Maclean was a man who lived for his sheep and his dream. He wouldn't know a Cartier cufflink from a trouser button, and he certainly wouldn't have the sophistication to steal them and keep them in a kitchen drawer where they could be easily found. It was a plant, a clumsy one designed to satisfy a man like Blair, who preferred easy answers to the truth. Once the crowd began to disperse, Hamish slipped around the side of Archie's cottage. He knew every inch of this land, every loose stone and hidden cranny. He walked toward the shed where Archie kept his shearing equipment. The door was slightly ajar, swinging on a rusted hinge. Inside, the air smelled of lanolin and old peat. Hamish pulled a small torch from his pocket and swept the beam across the floor. He wasn't looking for cufflinks, he was looking for what wasn't there. Archie was the village's unofficial handyman when it came to heavy wire and fencing. He kept a large spool of galvanized florist's wire on a peg by the window, the same wire used for the New Year's wreath. The peg was empty, but as the torchlight flickered over the workbench, Hamish saw something that made him whistle low. There was a smear of dark, oily grease on the wood, the kind used in high-end automotive engines, and beside it, a small, torn fragment of black silk. It wasn't a pair of pyjamas. It was a heavy, expensive silk, the kind used for the lining of a gentleman's overcoat. So, Hamish murmured to Lugs, who was sniffing the grease with deep suspicion. The man with the limp comes to the shed to get the wire. He plants the links in the cottage while Archie is out looking for a lost ewe, and then he goes to the gables to settle the account. But why the wreath, Lugs? Why the wreath from the hall? The answer came to him with the cold clarity of the mountain air. The wreath wasn't just a weapon, it was a signal. It was meant to make the death look like a local grievance, a village matter that the stupid local police would either miss or mishandle. The killer had counted on someone like Blair to jump at the easiest target, the limp, the wire cutters, the expensive car. It all pointed to a professional, but a professional who was working in tandem with someone who knew exactly where Archie kept his keys and his wire. He recalled the land agent's cottage and the black Mercedes. Forbes had a daughter with a gambling habit and a desperate need for money. Vane Smythe had lost that money. If Forbes had provided the local knowledge and the access, the man with the limp had provided the muscle. But there was another detail that didn't fit. The wreath had been taken from the village hall before the New Year's celebration had even ended. Mrs. Christie had seen the car at dawn, but the wreath had been missing since the stroke of midnight. Hamish felt a sudden sharp chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He realized the murder had not happened in the Earl. Why morning hours? It had happened while the village was singing Auld Lang Syne, while the bells were ringing, and while the noise nuisance Julian Vane Smythe was supposedly complaining about was at its height. The timeline Blair had constructed was a week out of sync with the reality of the Highland night. "I need to see the body again," Hamish said, his voice grim, "and I need to see what's missing from Julian's private office." He knew Blair would have the house locked down, but Blair's men were city boys. They didn't know about the cellar window at the gables that didn't latch properly, or the way the ivy provided a perfect ladder for a man as thin and agile as a Highland cat. If he could find the missing link, the piece of paper that Vane Smythe had turned white over, he would have the motive that turned a land agent into a conspirator and a London stranger into a killer. As the first proper snow of the year began to blanket Lochdubh in a deceptive white silence, Hamish Macbeth set off to break the law to uphold the truth. He had to prove Archie's innocence before the heavy gates of Strathbane prison shut for good, and before the man with the limp decided that one more accidental drowning wouldn't hurt the village's reputation. The snow was now falling in earnest, thick white flakes that muffled the sound of Hamish's footsteps as he skirted the perimeter of the Vane Smythe estate. The blue police tape fluttering against the iron gates looked garish and flimsy against the ancient, stoic stone of the Highlands. Hamish knew that Blair had left a single bored constable from Strathbane stationed in the warmth of the hallway inside, likely occupied with a tabloid newspaper and a thermos of tea. The DCI's arrogance was his greatest weakness. He believed that because he had arrested Archie McLean, the case was over, and the crime scene was merely a formality waiting to be swept away. Hamish, however, knew that the shadows of the gables held the true story, one that had nothing to do with stolen cufflinks or a simple local grudge. He reached the side of the house where the heavy ivy coiled like sleeping serpents up the grey stone. Luggs stayed at the edge of the woods, a silent sentinel who knew better than to follow his master on a housebreaking expedition. Hamish tested the cellar window. As he suspected, the frame was warped by a century of Lochdubh damp, and with a bit of leverage from his pocket knife, it groaned open just enough for his lanky frame to squeeze through. He landed softly on a pile of coal sacks, the air smelling of dust and expensive furnace oil. He moved through the darkness with the practiced ease of a man who had spent many a night avoiding the gaze of gamekeepers, reaching the ground floor and slipping into Julian Vane Smythe's private study. The room was an exercise in vulgar wealth. Leather-bound books that had never been read, a mahogany desk the size of a small boat, and a scent of stale cigar smoke. Hamish pulled out his torch, the thin beam illuminating the chaotic state of the desk. Blair's team had been through it, of course, but they had been looking for obvious clues, threats, poison, or perhaps a hidden stash of gold. Hamish wasn't looking for what was there. He was looking for what a desperate man would want to disappear. He moved toward the wall safe, which stood ajar, its contents rifled and discarded. Blair had noted the missing cash and jewellery as further proof of Archie's robbery gone wrong, but Hamish's eyes were drawn to the shredder in the corner. It was full. Tiny ribbons of paper were packed into the bin like confetti. Hamish knelt, sifting through scraps. Most of it was recent, bank statements, investment brochures, the mundane debris of a failing financier, but tucked into the teeth of the blades, as if the machine had jammed in a hurry, was a small, unshredded corner of a heavy cream-coloured parchment. It bore a crest that Hamish recognised immediately, the seal of the Highland Restoration Fund. But it wasn't the crest that froze his blood, it was the single word typed above it, blackmail. The pieces began to shift in Hamish's mind, the cold logic of the situation settling like the frost outside. Julian Vane Smythe hadn't just been losing his own money, he had discovered that the pillars of local society were dipping their hands into the charity's coffers to maintain their crumbling estates. He had tried to play the city game in a village that operated on blood and and he hadn't been murdered because he was a nuisance. He had been murdered because he was a predator who had chosen the wrong prey. Forbes, the land agent, was the one who managed the fund's physical assets, and it was Forbes who would have been the first to feel the squeeze of Vane Smythe's demands. But Forbes was a soil man, not a blade man. The man with the limp, the professional from Mercedes, was the missing link. As Hamish stood in the darkened study, he realised the true horror of the trap. Vane Smythe had invited the man with the limp to the Highlands, thinking he was hiring muscle to enforce his blackmail. Instead, the very people Julian was trying to bleed dry had bought off the muscle. It was a double cross of Shakespearean proportions, executed with the cold efficiency of a business merger. The wreath hadn't been a signal of local anger, it had been a cruel joke, a way to use the village's own traditions to mock the man who had tried to silence them. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Hamish doused his torch, his heart thundering. He pressed himself against the heavy velvet curtains, the silver salmon in his pocket feeling like a lead weight. Through the crack in the door, he saw a sliver of light. It wasn't the bored constable from Strathbane. The light was moving with purpose, scanning the floor, seeking something the killers had forgotten in their haste. The figure entered the room, the beam of their flashlight reflecting off the polished mahogany. It was Forbes. The land agent looked aged, his face a mask of terror and exhaustion. He wasn't looking for money, he was looking for the same fragment of parchment Hamish had just discovered. "It's not here," Forbes whispered to himself, his voice cracking with a desperation that made Hamish almost pity him. "If he finds it, he'll kill us all. He'll kill us all." Hamish stayed motionless, a shadow among shadows. He understood now. Forbes wasn't the mastermind, he was a puppet who had realized too late that he was dancing for a monster. The man with the limp wasn't just a hitman, he was someone with a personal stake in the restoration fund, someone who couldn't afford a scandal, and if Forbes didn't find the evidence of the blackmail, the man with the limp would ensure there were no witnesses left in Lochdubh to talk. The realization hit Hamish with the force of a gale. Archie McLean wasn't just a convenient scapegoat for Blair, he was a distraction for the killer. While the police were busy processing an innocent man in Strathbane, the true architect of the crime was right here, cleaning up the final traces of his involvement. Hamish knew he couldn't confront Forbes now, not without the full picture. He needed to find where that dark Mercedes was hidden, and he needed to do it before the snow covered the tracks for good. He watched as Forbes retreated from the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat, leaving Hamish alone in the dark with a piece of paper that was effectively a death warrant. He slipped back out through the cellar window, the freezing air a welcome relief after the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Lugs were waiting, a dark shape against the white ground. Hamish patted the dog's head, his mind spinning. The motive wasn't petty, it was existential. It was about the survival of the old guard against the parasitic greed of the newcomer. But in the Highlands, the old guard could be just as ruthless as any city gangster. He needed to set a trap, and he needed to use the one thing everyone in the village underestimated, his own supposed stupidity. He began the long walk back to the station, not to sleep, but to begin spreading the kind of rumor that would bring a predator out into the open. He would let it be known that poor, dim Hamish had found a very interesting piece of paper in the fountain, something the big city detectives had missed. The snow was now a thick, swirling curtain that threatened to cut Lochdubh off from the rest of the world, a circumstance that Hamish Macbeth usually found comforting but today found fraught with a cold, sharpening tension. He arrived back at the police station in the small hours, the silver salmon now frozen stiff in his pocket, a grim souvenir of a morning that felt a lifetime ago. He did not go to bed. Instead, he stoked the peat fire until the heart glowed a dull, defiant red, and sat at his kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee and the scrap of parchment he had salvaged from the shredder, the G. Abel's. The word blackmail stared back at him, a jagged piece of a mirror reflecting the rot beneath the village's picturesque surface. To save Archie and to keep himself from being exiled to the smog of Glasgow, Hamish knew he had to act as the catalyst for the killer's next mistake. By 8 o'clock the following morning, the village was beginning to stir, the smoke from chimneys rising straight into the frozen air. Hamish began his rounds, but he did not move with his usual aimless shuffle. He walked with the deliberate, heavy-footed gait of a man who was carrying a secret far too big for his britches. His first stop was the grocery shop, where Mr. Patel was already busy clearing a path through the drifts. Hamish stood on the doorstep, blowing on his hands and looking around with an exaggerated air of conspiracy that he knew would be relayed to every kitchen in the parish within the hour. "A bad business about Archie, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, his voice loud enough to carry to the two women waiting for their milk delivery. "DCI Blair is very pleased with himself. He thinks he's wrapped the whole thing in a bow. But between you and me, the man's a fool. He missed the most important thing. I went back to the fountain this morning, just to see if the snow had uncovered anything, and you'll never believe what I found wedged in the plumbing. A letter, Mr. Patel. A letter that names names. It's a bit damp, mind you, and I can't quite make out the signature yet, but I've got it. Drying by the fire at the station. Once the ink is clear, I'll have to call Strathbane and tell them they've got the wrong man." Patel's eyes widened, his hands pausing over a crate of cabbages. "A letter, Hamish? From the victim?" "Aye," Hamish nodded solemnly, his expression one of vacant, earnest pride. It's great evidence. I'm just a simple village constable, so I'll need to be careful with it. I've left it on the mantelpiece to dry out properly. I'm going over to the hotel now to see if Nessie has a bit of breakfast for a hero of the law. He repeated the performance at the hotel and again near the post office, ensuring that the man with the limp and his local accomplice would hear that the stupid policeman was sitting on a ticking time bomb of a document. Hamish knew the psychology of the guilty. They could ignore a clever man, but they could not ignore a lucky fool. By mid-afternoon the trap was set. He returned to the station, fed Lugs a double portion of meat, and moved his favourite armchair away from the fire and into the deep shadows of the corner directly opposite the hearth, where a decoy piece of parchment sat drying on the mantelpiece. The hours ticked by with agonizing slowness. The light faded from the sky, leaving Lochdubh a world of ink and silver. Inside the station, the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the occasional hiss of the peat. Hamish sat perfectly still, his long legs tucked under him, his hazel eyes fixed on the door. He had left the back door unbolted, a silent invitation to anyone who thought they could outsmart a Highland bobby. He knew that the professional, the man in the Mercedes, would likely be the one sent to do the dirty work, but he suspected the mastermind would not be far behind. It was nearly midnight when the back door creaked. It was a tiny sound, a mere sigh of metal against wood, but in the silence of the station it sounded like a gunshot. Hamish didn't move. He watched a shadow come loose from the darkness of the scullery and crept into the kitchen. The figure was tall and moved with a rhythmic heavy hitch in its gait, the unmistakable limp of the man Mrs. Christie had seen. The intruder moved toward the fireplace, a gloved hand reaching for the decoy paper. In the dim light of the dying embers, Hamish saw the glint of a silenced pistol tucked into the man's waistband. "It's a bit late for a social call, is it not?" Hamish's voice was a low, melodic growl that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. The man whirled around, his hand flying to the gun, but he was too slow. Hamish had spent his life navigating the uneven terrain of the hills. He moved with a sudden, explosive grace that defied his lanky appearance. He kicked the chair forward, catching the intruder in the shins, and before the man could recover, Hamish was on him, his large hands clamping down on the man's wrist with the strength of a blacksmith. They went down in a heap, the intruder snarling as he tried to bring the weapon to bear. Lugs, usually the most peaceful of creatures, let out a terrifying throat-tearing bark and pinned the man's other arm with his weight. His teeth bared inches from the killer's throat. "I wouldn't move if I were you," Hamish panted, twisting the gun from the man's grip. Lugs have a very low opinion of people who break into police stations, and he hasn't had his teeth brushed in a week. As he pinned the intruder to the floor, the station's front door opened. Hamish expected to see Blair, but instead it was Mr. Forbes, the land agent, his face white with terror, followed closely by a figure that made Hamish's heart sink. It was the Colonel's brother-in-law, a man of high standing and even higher debts, who had been the secret treasurer of the Restoration Fund. "Is it done?" the newcomer hissed, before seeing Hamish holding the gun. He froze, his eyes darting toward the mantelpiece. "It's done in the sense that your friend here is going to be spending a long time in a cell," Hamish said, standing up and keeping the weapon levelled at the trio. "And I imagine the Strathbane forensics team will be very interested in that black Mercedes parked in the woods behind the old kirk. You see, the problem with city folk is that you think we're all as dim as the peat smoke. You thought you could use a village wreath to frame a village man, but you forgot that in Lochdubh we know exactly who's capable of tying a knot that tight." Forbes collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. "I told you, Geoffrey. I told you we couldn't just kill him. Vane Smythe was a shark, but this is madness." "The madness was thinking you could blackmail a man who has nothing left to lose." The man with the limp spat from the floor, his eyes fixed on Hamish with a cold professional hatred. Hamish reached over and picked up the telephone. He didn't dial Blair's direct line. He dialed the local operator, Mrs. McLean, knowing that within 5 minutes the entire village would know that the constable had caught the real killers. "Mrs. McLean, it's Hamish. Could you put me through to the Chief Constable's private residence in Strathbane? I know it's late, but tell him I've got a bit of a New Year's present for him. It seems DCI Blair's open and shut case has just fallen through the ice." He looked at the 3 men. the broken agent, the desperate aristocrat, and the cold-blooded hitman, and felt a wave of profound tiredness. The peace of Lochdubh had been restored, but the price was the exposure of the rot at the heart of the glen. He knew what would happen next. Blair would arrive, red-faced and screaming, and try to salvage his reputation by claiming he had been working undercover with Hamish all along. And Hamish, true to his nature, would let him. He had no desire for glory, only for the quiet return to his stove and his dog. But first, he had to ensure that Archie McLean was released, and that the man with the limp never had the chance to wall. The hills of Sutherland again. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing through the snow-choked valley, Hamish Macbeth sat back down in his armchair. He took the silver salmon from the sink and watched. It was a fine fish. It would make a grand supper once the shouting was over. He had saved his job, saved his friend, and proved that even the laziest man in the Highlands was more than a match for the greed of the South. He merely hoped that the next newcomer to Lochdubh would have the sense to leave the bells, the sheep, and the police constable well enough alone. The tension inside the small police station was as thick and stifling as the peat smoke curling from the hearth. Hamish stood with the confiscated pistol held loosely but firmly in his right hand, his eyes never leaving the three men who had disrupted the sanctity of his kitchen. The hitman on the floor, whom Hamish now recognized as a man named Miller, from the more shadowed corners of the London underworld, let out a low, guttural curse as lugs continued to guard him with a low, vibrating growl. Geoffrey, the aristocrat who had so nearly escaped with the reputation of a gentleman, stood by the door, his face a mask of crumbling arrogance. He looked at the modest kitchen, the half-eaten scone on the table, and the gangly policeman who had bested him, and for a moment the silence was so profound that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a hammer against an anvil. "You don't understand, Mac." "Beth," Geoffrey said, his voice regaining a tremor of its usual superiority despite the circumstances. Vane Smythe was a parasite. He was going to dismantle the fund, sell off the ancestral lands for a pittance to cover his own debts, and drag every respectable name in the county through the mud. We did what had to be done to preserve the heritage of the Highlands. A common constable like you should appreciate that. Hamish leaned against the dresser, the flickering firelight casting long, dancing shadows across his face. "I appreciate the heritage of the Highlands just fine, sir, but I find it's usually the people who talk loudest about preserving things who are the ones most busy, stuffing their pockets with what's left of them. You didn't kill him for the heritage. You killed him because he found out you'd been treating the Restoration Fund like your own private piggy bank. And as for Archie McLean, you were quite happy to let a man who has lived his whole life on these hills rot in a cell just to keep your hands clean." Before Geoffrey could respond, Miller, sensing a momentary lapse in Hamish's attention, made a desperate lunge for the heavy iron poker by the fireplace. He moved with a surprising serpentine speed for a man with a heavy limp, but Hamish was faster. He didn't use the gun. Instead, he swung his long-booted leg around, catching Miller's wrist and pinning against the stone hearth. Lugs let out a roar of a bark, snapping his jaws inches from Miller's ear, and the hitman collapsed back onto the floor, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and frustration. "I told you," Hamish said, his voice dropping into that dangerously soft tone that preceded a storm. "The dog doesn't like you, and to be honest, I'm starting to find your company a bit wearisome myself." The sound of tires crunching on the frozen gravel outside announced the arrival of the cavalry. A moment later, the front door was kicked open with such force that it hit the wall with a resounding crack. DCI Blair charged in, followed by a phalanx of uniformed officers from Strathbane. Blair's face was a violent shade of crimson, his eyes bulging as he took in the scene, his useless constable standing over three suspects, one of whom was a high-profile figure in the county's social register, and another who was clearly a professional criminal. "What in the name of God is going on here, Macbeth?" Blair roared, his hands trembling with a mixture of cold and fury. "I told you to stay put. I told you the case was closed. Why are you holding a weapon? And why is the Honourable Geoffrey standing in your kitchen like a common vagrant?" Hamish lowered the gun and handed it, grip first, to a bewildered Detective Sergeant Jimmy Anderson, who had followed Blair into the room. "The case was never closed, sir. It was just slightly misdirected. It turns out Archie McLean didn't have much use for London hitmen or black Mercedes cars. These gentlemen were in full confession when you arrived. Miller here, the one on the floor, was the one who did the heavy lifting at the fountain. Mr. Forbes provided the local access, and Geoffrey here was the one who signed the checks. Or, more accurately, he was the one who couldn't afford to have Vane Smythe keep talking about where those checks were going." Blair's jaw dropped. He looked at Geoffrey, then at the hitman, then back at Hamish. The realization that he had nearly sent an innocent local to prison, while the real killers were having brandy at their clubs, began to sink in, followed rapidly by the realization that this was going to look catastrophic in his quarterly review. He turned on Geoffrey, his instinctive sycophancy warring with his need to appear in control. "Is this true? Have you been interfering with a police investigation?" Geoffrey didn't answer. He simply turned his head away. The weight of the evidence Hamish had gathered, the fragment of parchment, the wire cutters, the sightings of the car, rendering any denial futile. Forbes, however, broke. The land agent began to sob, the words tumbling out of him in a desperate, pathetic stream. He confessed to everything: the missing funds, the blackmail, the meeting at the jetty, and the horrific moment when Miller had twisted the New Year's wreath around Farnes Smythe's neck while the rest of the village was singing and celebrating. "He wouldn't stop," Forbes wailed. "He was going to take everything. We didn't have a choice." Blair, seeing the opportunity to seize the narrative, pushed Hamish aside and began barking orders. "Anderson, get these men into the vans. Secure the weapon. I want a full forensics team at the Gables and at the land agent's office immediately. I knew there was something suspicious about that Mercedes report." "Well done, team. We've cracked it." Hamish retreated to the corner of the kitchen, watching the chaotic flurry of arrests with a tired, cynical eye. He saw Blair, already rehearsing his speech for the press, shifting the credit for the investigation's tactical shift onto his own shoulders. Jimmy Anderson caught Hamish's eye and gave a small, appreciative nod, the only recognition Hamish would likely receive from the Strathbane force. As the suspects were led into the snow, Blair turned to Hamish, his eyes narrowing. "You were lucky," Macbeth, Blair spat, though the usual volume was missing from his voice. "You've made a mess of my station, you've endangered a dog, and you've disrupted a high-level operation. If I find one thing out of place in your report, I'll have your head on a platter. And don't you think for a second that this changes anything. You're still a lazy, insubordinate peasant." "Of course, sir," Hamish said, his expression one of perfect, vacuous obedience. "I'm just glad the real police arrived to tidy things up. I was getting quite worried about the floorboards." Blair snorted and stormed out, leaving the station suddenly, jarringly quiet. Snow kept falling outside, burying the tracks of the police vans and the Mercedes alike. Hamish stood in the middle of his kitchen, the silence turning like a familiar friend. He looked at the empty chair where Miller had been pinned, then at the fireplace where the decoy letter had been. It had been a messy, dangerous business, and for a moment the darkness of the Highlands had felt a little more oppressive than usual. But then he remembered Archie. He picked up the phone one last time and dialed the Strathbane holding cells. "This is Constable Macbeth. I believe you've just received word to release Archie McLean." "Aye, that's right. Tell him I've got a pot of coffee and a bit of salmon waiting for him. And tell him to bring his own tobacco. I'm fresh out." As he hung up, Hamish felt the tension drain from his shoulders. The Sassenach was gone, the killers were caught, and the village of Lochdubh had survived another attempt to modernize its scandals. He walked over to the stove and began to reheat the coffee, the rhythmic clinking of the pot against the burner the only sound in the room. He had no interest in the promotions or the accolades that would inevitably be heaped upon Blair. All he wanted was to stay right where he was, in a village that understood that sometimes the best way to see the truth was to sit quietly and wait for the snow to stop. The following morning, the sun rose over a Lochdubh that looked like a scene from a confectioner's window, draped in a thick, pristine layer of white that hid the scars of the previous night's violence. The village was quiet, but it was the quiet of a community alling in collective relief. Hamish Macbeth stood at the window of his station, watching a solitary robin hop across the frozen windowsill. The frantic energy of the Strathbane police had dissipated, leaving behind only the cold, sharp scent of ozone and pine. The phone on the wall began to ring. and this time Hamish answered it with a slow, deliberate hand. It was Detective Chief Inspector Blair, and even through the receiver the man's voice carried the inflated boom of a peacock in full strut. "Macbeth, listen to me and listen well," Blair barked, though there was an uncharacteristic note of triumph that replaced his usual vitriol. "The Chief Constable is over the moon. The press are calling the arrest of Miller and the exposure of the Restoration Fund scandal the investigative triumph of the decade. I've just finished a briefing with the BBC, and I made sure to mention that the operation was conducted under my direct and constant supervision. I've characterized your involvement as, let's say, providing essential local logistical support under my specific guidance." Hamish leaned against the wall, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. This was the most delicate part of the dance, the moment where he had to ensure he remained small enough to be forgotten. "That's grand news, sir. Truly grand. I was worried my clumsy interference might have cluttered up your brilliant strategy. It's a relief to know the credit is going exactly where it belongs. I suppose a promotion to superintendent is practically a formality now. You'll be heading to the big headquarters in Glasgow or Edinburgh before the month is out, no doubt." There was a brief, telling silence on the other end of the line. Blair, despite his arrogance, was a man who craved the city lights and the power of a larger pond. The prospect of leaving the miserable bogs of the Highlands for a prestigious desk in the city was his ultimate ambition. "Well, Macbeth, the chief did mention that a man of my caliber is wasted in the northern divisions. There's talk of a specialized task force in the central belt. But what about you? The chief saw your name in the initial report and suggested you might be due for a sergeant's exam and a transfer to a busier station. Strathbane needs a new custody officer." Hamish's heart did a slow, cold roll in his chest. A transfer to Strathbane was his version of a death sentence. He looked out at the loch, at the smoke rising from the cottages, and at Lugs, who was currently dreaming of rabbits by the fire. He had to be careful. If he appeared too clever, he was a threat. If he appeared too useful, he was a candidate for promotion. He had to be a liability. "Oh, sir, I don't know about that," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, stumbling Highland burr. "To be honest, sir, the paperwork for this case has me in a terrible muddle. I've lost my notes twice, and I think I might have accidentally deleted the digital logs you asked for. And then there's he matter of the procedural errors I made during the arrest. If the defense lawyers find out I didn't read Miller his rights until after the dog had a go at him, or that I forgot to bag the evidence in the proper sequence, well, it might reflect poorly on whoever was supposed to be supervising me. It would be a shame if your brilliant career was tarnished by the bumbling of a country copper who can't even fill out a mileage form correctly." The silence on the line this time was longer and much deeper. Hamish could almost hear the gears turning in Blair's head as the DCI weighed the glory of the arrest against the risk of being linked to Hamish's incompetence. If Hamish was promoted or transferred, his files would be audited, his methods scrutinized, and Blair's direct supervision would be revealed as the fiction it was. "You really are a useless piece of work, aren't you, Macbeth?" Blair finally spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of relief and disgust. "Fine. I'll tell the chief that you're emotionally volatile and unsuitable for promotion. I'll say you've developed a nervous condition after the confrontation, and that you're best left to rot in that godforsaken village where you can't do any more damage to the force's reputation. I'll handle the final reports myself to ensure they're legally watertight. Just stay out of my sight, do you hear me? If I see your ginger head again before I move to Glasgow, I'll have you directing traffic in a blizzard. Thank you, sir." "You're a true gentleman," Hamish said softly. He hung up the phone and let out a long, slow breath. The danger had passed. He was still a lowly constable, still the lazy policeman of Lochdubh, and most importantly, he was still exactly where he wanted to be. An hour later, the station door opened and Archie McLean walked in. He looked weary, and his clothes were wrinkled from his stay in the cells, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, quiet gratitude. He didn't say thank you in the Highlands. Such things were understood without the need for tawdry words. Instead, he reached into his coat and produced a small battered tin of high-quality tobacco, sliding it across the table toward Hamish. "The coffee's on the stove, Archie," Hamish said, gesturing toward the pot. "And the salmon is pan. I believe we have a bit of catching up to do on the village gossip. I hear Mrs. Wellington is already organising a committee to choose a new noise-compliant wreath for next year. Archie sat down, the familiar smell of peat and tobacco beginning to fill the room. They say the Colonel's brother-in-law is going to be travelling abroad for a long time, Hamish, and a young lad from Inverness who doesn't know a fence post from a telephone pole has replaced that Forbes. Change comes to the Glen, Archie, but it never stays for long, Hamish remarked, pouring 2 mugs of the thick black brew. He looked at the fire, at his dog, and at the peaceful, snow-covered world outside his door. The Sassenach was gone, the city trouble had been excised, and the social order, flawed and eccentric as it was, had been restored. Julian Vane Smythe had tried to silence the bells of Lochdubh, but in the end it was the silence of the village itself that had proven to be his undoing. Hamish picked up his mug and leaned back in his chair, feeling the warmth of the station wrap around him like a heavy coat. He had no more murders to solve, no more inspectors to dodge, and no more paperwork to fake, at least for today. As the afternoon light began to fade into a soft Highland violet, the Constable of Lochdubh closed his eyes, content to let the rest of the world hurry on without him. He was home, he was safe, and the only thing on his horizon was the simple, honest pleasure of a well-cooked meal and a quiet night's sleep. The mystery was over, but for Hamish Macbeth, the real work of doing as little as possible was just beginning.